On this episode, I'm speaking with Barbara Savona, CEO of Sprout Marketing. Sprout is a multifamily platform that simplifies personalized marketing touchpoints and focuses on small, consistent changes that deliver significant results. Barbara is a seasoned entrepreneur with a passion for property management, marketing, and wellness. You can also catch her hosting her weekly podcast, Marketing Home, Marketing You. It was a pleasure welcoming my friend Barbara to the podcast. It was a great conversation, so let's jump right in. Man, it is such a pleasure to have you on the show. It's always good to be able to interview someone who I consider a friend at this point. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Chris. I'm so excited for us to do this on your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to kick things off like I normally do with the origin story of Barbara.
Okay.
I'd love to start there, hear more about what is a bilingual upbringing, but not in the way that many listeners probably expect. There was no English involved in that bilingual upbringing. So let's start there. Tell us your story from the early years, and we'll kick things off.
Okay, so I forgot that I used to start my presentations when I do a lot of speaking. I would tell people I'm half German, I'm half Mexican, I'm a Germex, which sounds like a disinfectant, and I'm also a clean freak. So like that title actually fits perfectly.
Perfect.
But my mom is from Germany, my dad from Mexico. My dad was born in the States, but his family is from Mexico. And so we lived in Mexico with my grandparents until I was 5 years old. So for me, Spanish was my first language. Back in the day, I didn't have to pay to be a blonde. I was like a baby blonde, real white hair. And I was really running around the streets of Mexico with my cousins. It was a very small area, where my grandparents lived. And I don't even, I think that what's really interesting is people would always stop me on the street when I was little to get like, where are you from or whatever. And I had no idea that I was different, which I think is what's so special about kids when they're really little. They just don't see anything. They're just like, we're all kids, we're having a good time.
Yeah.
And so that was part of my life. My parents didn't have a lot of money, but it was important for my mom that we would go back and see her family. So I think around the age of like 1.5 or 2, we started doing most summers in Germany. But because it was such an expense, we would stay for 6 weeks. Most of the time, my dad didn't come because he had to stay and work. And that was basically the upbringing that I had. Mexico most of the time, Germany for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, my mom would put me in a school. So I learned German. I was already speaking Spanish. We only spoke Spanish at home. And then somewhere around the age of like 3 or 4, it was very like a mixed conversation. So like half my sentences I would be talking in Spanish, half in German. Yeah, so it was a very interesting thing. I remember my mom would tell the story that the first trip to Germany, I was so little, I learned German. And in those 6 weeks, it was almost like that became my new identity. And I came home and my dad, my Mexican dad, Mija, so excited to see him. And I looked at him and I hugged him, but I started speaking German. And he said, he looked at my mom and he said, what did you do? She can't even talk to me
Oh,
in
no.
German, in Spanish. And so it took me a few days to like pick that Spanish back up again. And it was just it was a really unique and a really cool childhood in that perspective when I look back on it.
One of the things that you mentioned to me really tied back to this hardworking ethic, both in Mexico and in Germany. And I think that probably speaks to where we'll get to later in this conversation with regards to your business leadership. But what were a couple anecdotes, both in Mexico and in Germany, if you can remember, that tie back to that work ethic mentality?
100%. So it was really interesting because there was a lot of poverty in Mexico. And my great great grandmother was this like tiny little Mexican Indian descent. And I just remember the kids, we would laugh because she had the biggest, longest ears. That was like her. And we would say that, like, we would joke, like, don't say anything because she could hear us. But what I remember is the floors were dirt floors. And every day she was in there sweeping it because it was about no matter what you had, you still keep that area, you take pride and you keep it clean. And then in Germany, it was totally different. Germany, very driven, lots of hard work, technology. But the area where my grandparents were from, it was a dairy farm. And I remember, we'd walk the town and it was a very picturesque little town. and you would almost not even notice the houses that would have flowers. You would notice the one random one where there was not like the beautiful floral and landscaping,
Mm.
because there was a lot of pride in keeping your home, a certain way. And that was a big thing. My grandmother, I mean, I remember that even being a teenager when I'd go visit, and it was like she worked into the night. Like they were hard workers, and hard work on both sides of my family was something that was almost like you kind of got your identity from showing up and working hard.
Absolutely. And so you ultimately ended up back in Texas, and you were, when I think of like ESL classes, I think of, you know, uh, kids from Mexico coming and moving to the States. And they're sort of in these, when I grew up, kind of these special classes to get them integrated into the school and society, and obviously learning the language. So you found yourself in that position at a young age. How old were you when that transition was occurring?
I think I was like 5 because it was kindergarten, and I was in an ESL program, English as a second language. And it was funny because I looked, like everybody assumed that I would be able to speak English. And it didn't take very long. I think that's what's also neat when you're little, and also the way the languages work. There's a lot of connectivity to learning the languages. I wish I would have almost learned more at that age. But yeah, I was in a situation where I was along with the other kids that had not ever been exposed to English. So we moved back to Texas. I was born in Texas, but lived in Mexico. Then we moved back to Texas. And then, in a way, that started my life, my very confused little self. Like, who am I?
Oh,
Am I Mexican? Am I German? Who am I? Where do I
s-
belong?
yeah. And so you were trilingual at that point, which I haven't asked you yet if you still use all three languages, but I can understand how the nature of that situation for you would leave you feeling like, where do I belong? Who am I? What is my identity? And I'm sure that was really difficult at that age.
It was very difficult, and it gave me a lot of empathy. I think like there's something when you're at a little age and you see, like in Mexico, there was a lot of poverty, but a lot of happiness. There was a lot of joy. And then in Germany, there was a lot of hard work, but sometimes at the expense of being joyful. Not always. There was a lot of joy there too.
Mm.
So as a child, kind of going into that and not knowing, we'd speak Spanish at home. When my mom didn't want anybody to understand anything, she talked to me in German. And then I'd go to school and I spoke, you know, English. And I felt very loved early on. Like I was the first grandchild on both sides. So that gave me a lot of attention and a lot of time. And so being in a school was just a little bit hard for me. I felt like very disconnected from my family. I wasn't used to a lot of the cultural norms. Like we were very tight. And then being in an area where that wasn't what was normal for every child, that was a little bit difficult. And so that was an adjustment period, as with anything. Like my dad says that he would drop me off at school. So just so that you know, a little side of my personality, and he'd say like some days, like when it was, I think it was the summer before school, I had to go to like a daycare. And he'd say that I would put one leg on each side of the door as he was trying to take me in, like, you're
Oh.
not taking me there. So I had like a very stubborn streak, but I think it was just because, again, I was like not sure of where I fit in. So,
Yeah.
and yes, I still speak Spanish. I do my best with English. And German, we went back not too long ago, and it was kind of the reverse. It took me 2 or 3 days. But as soon as like we were there for the third day, it was as if like this little piece of my brain opened up and I could speak it back the way that I did when I was
Oh,
young.
that's so fun. That's so fun. You actually shared something recently on LinkedIn that was so sweet and a little bit sad about being a little girl and having this backpack that you had gotten overseas, and you were taking it to school. And I can't remember if it was like the first day of school or something like that, but you were so proud. You brought it into class, and then you were immediately sort of like scrutinized and questioned
Yeah.
about the bag because it wasn't sort of like the style of the time or whatever. And when you mentioned having more empathy at that time and sort of growing up with empathy because you felt different, I thought that, looking back now at that post and thinking about that post, it seems to really highlight perfect example of what you're talking about.
That was a really weird time because I remember that I think when you're little, you're very sheltered of other people's opinion. Like you just have your parents' opinion and your grandparents' opinion. And for the most part, it's positive. And so this backpack that my grandparents had given me, it was like a leather stitched, very like rectangular, very German. Like it was just that was probably for a child there, you would use that backpack your entire like through middle school. So they're thinking about it like, how does that last? So I was so excited about it. And I remember when I walked in, so nervous, like I still get those nerves going into, any kind of social situation. It's just, I've had it since I was little. And then having a little girl so brazenly come up and be like, oh, that's ugly and you're weird. I just
Mhm.
remember being so crushed. It was like my first experience at just somebody being like mean for no reason and just critical for no reason. Like I'd gotten correction before, but this was just like pure criticism. And that was a weird moment, but it was almost pinned a lot of things for me that was, having the background that I had. There was a lot of scenarios like that where we just did things a little bit different. I think I have a lot of empathy for foreigners that come in. Mine was different because people expected me to be like everyone else because I looked very similar. But even for
Right.
people that are then feeling the additional that they look different, it's hard when you're coming in. And so I remember though, I did have a great cheerleader in my dad, and he would always tell me, and he did this for me through all my life. Like he had his things, but this was something he was so good at. And he would say, you have to think, he would always say, Mika, you have to think that what you have is such a special thing to have those grandparents that like you are doing this for you. And he said, most of those kids don't have that, and don't shrink from it. And so that's kind of been something that through my life has not, sometimes you'll see me share on LinkedIn. I loved thrifting. I love finding a good deal. It's not necessarily the popular thing, but as I've gotten older, there is a more of a comfort level in saying like, hey, this is a little different, but this is how I do life. And I'm sure there's other people that do it too. And I've seen that when you do speak about things that are maybe a little different, it gives people the permission to do whatever thing they want to talk about and be like, hey, it's cool. That's your
Mm.
thing.
Yeah, I think that the drive that you speak of there clearly ties back to how you were brought up, the grandparents that you were able to, be in great relationships with, even though they were so far apart.
Yeah.
And not to jump too far ahead, but it seems like that motivation and that drive really followed you through your schooling years, because you then ended up working a year before heading to UT Austin. You jumped into the college scene pretty quickly. Like from an early age, you kind of knew what you wanted and what you didn't want, which I think is very different than a lot of us, I'll say, especially at
Yeah.
that age. But I'm curious, like heading into college and kind of that entire life phase, what was your initial aim in terms of a degree? Did you know exactly what you wanted? And I'm looking at you and I'm smiling a little bit because I know what happens next. But like, what is that, or what was that phase like for you?
So there's a very practical side of me, and then there's a very impulsive side of me. It's like the two little things that live on your shoulders. I have both of them, and that I'm always kind of like toggling between. But yes, I literally would write out, like, always have a notebook with me, always have plans. I graduated a year early from high school, and I was always rewriting, like, what classes do I have to take to graduate early? I think I told you this one of the first times we met. I'm like probably the only person that like could not wait to grow up. And I love being an adult. Like when people say
Yeah.
adulting is hard, I'm like, it is, but like at least you have like agency over how your life can be. And so my plan was to go into marketing and advertising. That is what I initially started studying. And I didn't know exactly where I wanted to end up, but I loved business like since little. Like I always had little businesses that I was trying to make money. It just was something that my dad was an entrepreneur, my mom supported him, and so that was in my DNA big time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Transforming Cities, brought to you by Authentic. Authentic delivers premier multifamily brand experiences and smart digital marketing. Our proven approach aims to accelerate leasing velocity, boost rental rates, and increase long-term value. Simply put, we see brand as a business asset. You can find out more at authenticff.com. And something atypical happened really quickly at UT. You met your husband, and then you two met, fell in love, all the stars aligned, and you, I believe, were married six months later. Is that right?
Yeah. So it was like for me very much like I met my husband. I'd actually been dating somebody before for several, like kind of through my, your early years or whatever.
Hmm.
And that had ended. And I met my husband one night. A friend introduced me. He was not in UT, he was visiting friends. And I just was like, I feel like I always know what I like, and I was like, I like him. And so from meeting to marriage was 6 months. It was a whirlwind. I even remember, like, I still say this, like I was walking down the aisle like, what am I doing? This is crazy. But my husband had such a good like character heart. We very much aligned. And yeah, so I got married. I quit school. I remember sitting and talking to his dad, and his dad was like, "You're not going to end up going back if you get married." And I'm like, "Yes, I will." And of course, like he was right. I got married, started working. It was like thrust into real life real fast. But I've been married 21 years, and I would literally do it
Yeah.
all over again. So I don't recommend it for the young ones. Hopefully, nobody like really young is listening to this because I don't think this works for everyone. But that was definitely my unconventional path.
I would love to continue down that unconventional path because that phase of life landed you both back in Dallas, whereas we've discussed things were the quite the opposite of shiny, clean, neat, and perfect. And I think this is where your story to me gets really interesting, especially knowing where you are today. What were some of those stories like? What did you encounter as a young professional in and around Dallas?
This was a really challenging time for me, like personally and professionally. And it was also some of my best years, which is, I find that in my life has always been the case. So I was very much in love. First time, like I was very innocent in a lot of ways. So this was like very first time living with someone, being with someone that way, like all these things. And then also taking on responsibilities as a property manager. So I had worked for a really nice company in Austin while I was in school, an A plus plus product. I was selling and leasing apartments where the commissions were $300 to $500 at the time. It was like, crazy. I was making so much money as a kid,
Mm,
basically. Then I moved to Dallas and I was in a rougher part of town. The only job I could get was at a community that, now would be considered a challenging community. But the exchange was that we could get a free apartment, which sounded great when you're newly married and figuring things out. So my real rough part was that one, I was trying to be a good wife, figuring out what that was, and I was trying to be a really good property manager, and I was finding a lot of conflict. And so the area that we were in, you're right, it wasn't very clean. There was a lot of gang wars going on. I mean, there was a lot of scary scenarios even now looking back. Um, one day somebody, was upset that I was charging a late fee, came in the door and locked my door behind him as he came into my office, and I was by myself in
mm.
the office, and I had my radio and I had a code with my maintenance man. So I was like, trying to like push the code, and he came in very quickly. Later that day, we had a brick thrown into our bedroom window like at 2 in the morning or something crazy. A week
Wow.
later, my husband's car was stolen, found stripped in the middle of like a shopping center by the police. And so there was a lot of crazy things like that. My, first community that I was overseeing went with my maintenance man to do delinquencies, found somebody that had been shot in their apartment. I mean, there was things like that at
Ugh.
20 years old, you're just very much like, I feel like I was forced to be an adult very early and confront things that sometimes people will never confront. And I think to me, that's where, again, the empathy for the property manager comes in because I was there and I was just like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe. And I'm like making, $14 an hour. This is crazy.
Mm,
Like, who does this?
yeah. So what happened between and I don't want to go through this too quickly, but I'm sure there were a few important steps that happened between, wide-eyed 20-year-old woman who is suddenly in the mix of everything, in the middle of everything, and as you said, also trying to be a successful wife, have a successful marriage and job, and kind of balance all these things to where we're going to get to in a moment, which is Sprout Marketing. What were the steps that were taken, and within that, I'm curious, and we haven't really talked about this too much yet, Barbara, but
Are you throwing me a curveball?
I'm throwing you a curveball here. So here it comes. But you're probably already planning on this because I know your nature. But did you plan to get to that point when you were seeing what you were seeing as a 20 something year old? Did you think to yourself, okay, this is not where I want to be, and this is where I'm going to head, and this is how I'm going to get there?
So a little yes and no, back to kind of that personality. It was like I knew there had to be a better way. I knew that I wasn't willing to sacrifice my marriage to just like be this incredible manager. And I also knew that I didn't want to work for somebody forever. So I had that entrepreneur spirit since then. So between then and there, I tried to, take up as many experiences as possible. So any promotion, anything, I was overseeing one of those difficult properties. And then I was eventually overseeing three and then five. And it was one of those where you didn't have a washer or you didn't have a dishwasher, but you couldn't get a new one. So you basically borrowed it from one to put in another. And then you're just backfilling whatever you could. So from
Mm,
there, I was promoted within that company. I got to kind of see the back end. And I feel like my first job, I learned a lot of the crossing the T's, dotting the I's. I worked for Graystar. So that was like, okay, that they taught me how to do things right. This other company, I won't even name owner operator. It was like all hands on deck. Sometimes things are a little chaotic. And I was able to move through the ranks there. I was eventually not poached, but like recruited to do launch magazines. And so that kind of appealed to my advertising side. But I was really fortunate. I got a mentor that literally spent every single day with me for like months. And he taught me the ins and outs of every part of the business financials. I met with legal, I met with our distribution team, I met with our advertisers, I was doing selling, I was doing trade shows. In that span of time, he literally showed me how to run a business, and he was a great businessman. So he would always joke and he'd say, people complain about paying taxes. And he'd say, I just want to make sure that I make enough money where paying taxes isn't even an issue. And it was like he was always
mm,
teaching me the financials behind things, which I didn't see that so much with my family. I saw the hustle, but this is where I really learned how to become scalable, profitable. Everything he would tell me is like, well, if you don't want to do that 6 months from now, he's like, you better be thinking about how you're going to replace yourself in this role. So it was just constant hands-on learning. And so from there, I ended up moving cities. We moved back to the town where my family was at, and I had a non-compete, so I couldn't work for a while. And it was kind of during that time that my wheels started turning, like, what do I want to do? I started working for Rent, which is now CoStar, after my non-compete was up. And I got some experience and network under my belt. And I was there for a few years, had really great success with the company, was able to help launch new magazines, loved it, but still wanted to do something on my own. And so I think it was in '09. We were on a trip visiting my grandparents. This is very full circle kind of for
it
me,
is, yeah.
and we're sitting there, and it's just, you have that quiet to think like, I've been out of the rat race for just a few weeks. Like we took a good enough time, and I'm sitting there on their roof on the barn with all the stars. And I'm just like, I want to do something else. And this is where the partnership comes in. My husband's always been so supportive. He's like, let's do it. He said, look, we can cover it for so many months. And we made a realistic plan. I came back, I talked to my employer. They were so gracious with me. I mean, helped me out in more ways than I could ever thank them for. Awesome company. And I launched Sprout. And it was the clients that I had made relationships with that really helped propel the business forward at that point.
I always love to hear about the sort of early years of businesses like this because the Sprout of '09 is not the Sprout of 2023. So, what was the starting point of Sprout? What were you doing? How were you offering services? What were your packages? Like, what was the
Yeah.
and I know that you started it with someone else. So please feel free to sort of share the early details and what you kicked off Sprout actually doing.
So I started with someone that was also working with For Rent that had given notice before me. And we were like, let's do consulting. And so we'd do training. People always loved our training together. And so that's how we started. We started doing mini model packages. It was like, can you do this? Yes, we can do this. Can we do troubleshooting. We would do these like reports where we'd walk property and give them like a kind of our perspective. And about a few months in, she said, you know what? I'm actually going back to school. My passion is in education. I want to be a teacher again. Finish that out. So she went back to school. And then in a moment of just frustration, kind of doing things all by myself. I was venting to my best friend on our daily vent sessions. If, for all the ladies out there that have their girls that they do this with, that conversation. And I was just saying, Lauren, I cannot keep up with this. I said, I've got a stack of receipts in my console that are giving me anxiety at night. And she's like, well, get this. She was doing purchasing and troubleshooting for small businesses. And she's like, I have set up systems for this woman and she refuses to follow them. And I'm like, I need you. I said, we would
Yeah.
always joke like together we could be the perfect woman, apart we're a mess. And so very quickly, like I think about 8 months after I launched, I convinced her. And that was a big feat. I came from an entrepreneurial background. Lauren did not want that kind of a lifestyle. Our husbands were like, this is a terrible idea. We've been best friends since like 14 and 15. And so that was the start. To me, that was the start of the real Sprout, because
Yeah.
that was really the foundation and the partnership that's allowed it to be what it is today.
And you mentioned to me around that time how much of a struggle it was to feel like you were doing it all. You were trying to sort of be everything to everyone, and I can certainly relate to that. Having run Authentic and kind of gone through these different phases of entrepreneurialism and what does it mean and how do we best serve our partners and our clients. Obviously, reaching out to Lauren was a huge solve for you at that time, but were there other things that you did to address or to tackle those challenges of being spread too wide or too thin?
I think the partnership allowed us to really find our strengths. And it was like I was very front facing in sales and marketing, and Lauren was very operations. And so just doing that was the very first thing. So to me, the power of partnership, even if you're in a job where you're working for somebody else, I love to talk about that. It's like find that person that is your kind of other half. But then I also, from a business perspective, Dennis, my old boss, I remember he was like, if you're doing everything, you're never going to make money. He's like, if you touch everything, you're never going to be able to scale. He didn't even know this was advice kind of coming. And another little thought is like your mentors sometimes show up when they're not even there. And that was him
Mm,
showing up. And I remember we were driving back from a job. We had done a very labor intensive hands-on consulting project where we were doing outreach for them. We just kept thinking there's got to be a better way. At the same time, what was happening on the online scene, there were creators like Marie Forleo, Amy Porterfield that were starting to create like digital products and digital programs. And I was watching them. I had been through several of their programs. And I'm like, there's nothing like this in multifamily. There's nothing that is like a program that would allow us to have a further reach. And so that started the wheels turning on. Can we create a marketing membership for people?
mm.
And that's kind of how the core of what we do today was born on a road trip from an outreach marketing job.
Yeah, I would love to get into that. I mean, that to me is sort of where this idea of great relationships and entrepreneurship really start to blossom and come to fruition for Sprout. So I think it's been a couple of years now since you really walked me through the membership side of Sprout.
Yeah.
But I remember the first time I was observing you walk me through the process and what it was all about and how it worked. I was just thinking to myself at the time, man, this is so smart. This is such a great idea. Um, when did that piece emerge, and how, I guess, how did you solve for X? Like, how did you know, okay, this is the type of membership that multifamily needs, if that makes sense?
So I knew I wasn't going to be able to compete in the tech space. That was like I didn't have the business was a bootstrap business, and I never wanted to take any other outside funds or loans. That was important to me that it was 100% ours. So I wanted to solve for problems that a lot of supervisors don't even know exists. And I literally, this still is confounding to me today, that if you sit on site and you watch what a property manager, a leasing team, they're literally touching so many things. It's retention. It's social media. Back then it wasn't. It's a little bit of outreach marketing. It's, all these little pieces. It's the elevator's out. We need a sign to put up there. But, you don't want to say you're luxury and then have a Comic Sans sign, but you're also not a designer and you can't stop and like design something super cool. And it was
Yeah.
like, these are all the things that property managers actually do after hours because you don't have time to do them during the day. So to me, I was like, what if we could create this really cool resource training library that had the ideas, but then it went from idea to implementation. So, activate these ideas. So it was like the unsexy grassroots kind of stuff that people don't put a lot of emphasis on. But if you're an on-site manager, you know that that's what's actually happening on site. So
Mm,
the events that you have to host, like I would sit and watch a manager mess with an event flyer and spend an hour on it. And I'm thinking, that is not the best use of your time. And you know it, and I know it. And so to me, it was like, how do we create something that gave them access, got them 95% of the way there, but was created for multifamily housing? So not just a very generic site. And that was where the ideas started turning. I also was seeing that every consulting project, I was kind of giving the same advice. And I thought, okay, how do I magnify the reach? How do we put this under an umbrella where it's a different scenario, but it's basically the same principles? And that was when I said, I'm going to always teach on principles. I'll filter in trends, but the principles never change. And so go to the basics. And I really found a little niche in that, which was kind of cool.
yeah. Well, let's talk about like tactically what that was, because you mentioned flyers a couple minutes ago, but it was literally, starting with a few designs, a few different designs that became tens of designs that became hundreds of designs. What was the literal like tactical piece that you were giving back to the community, and how did that grow over the years?
So we had one business exchange that we had to have a product for, and it was 2 weeks away. And so we had an idea and we sat in a room, came up with taglines, and Lauren designed the flyers and we tweaked them, printed them out in an old school binder, went and did a pitch and said, your site will get 3 of these flyers that they can pick every month, one for retention, one for follow-up, and one for their outreach. That was the thing. And our team will customize it for you. And we pitched sites there. We got, I think, 30 or 40 communities at that one show. So it showed me that there was a need. We included printing at the
Mm,
time. And after that, people just started asking for more of that. And so we did another show and we picked up another 30 clients. And I was like, there's something to this. But then became the problem of all of these clients are on the same street and they're using the
mhm.
same flyer. So we've got to come up with a better system. So that's where we basically pulled back and said, what does this really look like? How do we create? And that was the evolution. So it started on literally one of those like albums on your phone that we could show people. It went to, I think it was a WordPress site, very basic. It eventually became a membership paid site where people could access, get templates. Now it integrates with Canva. So there's a lot of flexibility. It includes social media. So we kind of, and to talk about that, that is, I think, something people don't also always see is they think, oh, it's a membership program. That's awesome. But you're always having to watch the trends. So about maybe 8 years ago, 9 years ago, I was starting to see like social was becoming a trend and I could not find stock photography for apartments. Like it just, you'd find it, but it looked like a house and it didn't have diversity. So we made the decision at that point. We hired a full-time person. We rented an apartment and got a disclaimer. We cast models and we created thousands and thousands of photos that our members could access with all kinds of diversity and showing all different features. And it was like, I mean, the craziest thing. And looking back, it's like it was the right thing to do at the time, but we had no idea how visual marketing would blow up in the years. We just kind of saw a
Mm.
trend and we're like, okay, how do we do it? But we did it so bootstrapped. I mean, paying a photographer as a salaried employee, paying models. I mean, it was crazy. Like we'd never been in the casting thing and we'd cast models
Right.
and have people come in and I mean, waivers, the whole deal.
So the snowball effect was occurring. I mean, that snowball is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. What because I whenever I speak to founders and hear other founders talk about their journeys, there's always an element of luck and timing in addition to just the street smarts and the kind of the entrepreneurial spirit to keep going and to keep driving and to find out the answers and the solutions that your clients and your partners need. What happened along the way for you that you could kind of look back on now and say, okay, that was a great turning point. That was a great, hire that we had. What were a few of those different moments for you over the last, let's say, 10 years?
So the first one was Lauren. This would not be where it was today. That was the very first one. So partnership was one. The second one was trial and error. Like you said, a lot of it was luck. Everyone said don't hire friends and family. I've had the most success hiring friends and family. Like my sister worked for us for 10 years, left for 3 years. She just came back 2 weeks ago. I am like so excited to have her. So to me, that was another, and I can't say that that was like, I'm so intuitive that I knew that that was going to work. It just did. And it was how I live life. So I was like, well, if I love these people, I love work, I'm who I am at work and I am at home. It's not going to, there's going to be bumps. That worked out. Falling on my butt a few times. I had some clients that were so unaligned and so awful. And I was so willing to say yes because I wanted the revenue and the growth. And then they fired me when they got a new VP of marketing after 2 years of basically just,
Mm,
I mean, getting beat up by them and thinking to myself, I do not want, this is not how I want to do business. So it was a lot of that. Um, I think there was also the opportunity. I saw speakers in the industry getting a big reach. So we talk personal brand now. There was no LinkedIn at the time. You would get in a plane and go and speak. And so I said, well, I could do that. I could do it for free. That's my competitive advantage. They don't know that, I'm not really good at this point, but I know marketing. So I wrote to every association and said, I'll come for free. I paid for my travel and I started an email list. I had no idea that that was going to be such a huge thing. So I started an email list, 13 years ago, and it has grown into thousands and thousands now that get my emails on a weekly basis. So those were things that I didn't know. Like I was following again an online footprint for an industry that was not doing that model. And it worked. Like it was forging the way to do that. So like you said, it was a lot of trial and error. A few of those speaking events kind of just like exploded my reach, and people started being like, Barbara marketing, and
yeah.
it became like my name became synonymous. So the word of mouth became our number one driver and is still our number one driver of business, which I had no idea at the time that I was building a personal brand to support a company brand.
Yeah. And I think that gets to this next section I would really like to dive into, which is the businesswoman side of this, because I think it can't be highlighted enough how great of a businesswoman you've become over the years. And even if some of it felt a little bit accidental, right? Or sort of, it was a luck of the draw, something came along and it just, tended to work out. Those moments I think come and go, but I think the fact that you've been such a great businesswoman for so long needs to be highlighted. And so I want to talk about your business brain, your ability to adapt, your ability to scale, up and down as things change over the years. How have you taken that mindset with you across the years and applied it to what you feel like Sprout has become today, and certainly where you are headed next?
I think first of all, it's that I have to say, even that title or you saying that is still like so foreign to me because I feel like a worker bee in my company, but I love that role of business. I love building business. That's something that's so exciting to me. But I think the biggest thing is that I love to learn, and early on I saw the shortcut in having mentors, and so I started paying for mentors very early on. So when I talked about Marie Forleo, I was in one of her first pilot programs. At the time it was 2 grand. It was a lot. I paid for it out of pocket, even though the business could have paid for it. I was like, this is for me. The next year I paid for a one-on-one mentorship with someone that I got to spend a full day with, and like crazy amounts of money for one day. But I was like, I want to like get as much as I can. And after that, I got mentors at every single level. So I had an executive coach that worked with me every single week. I didn't know what it meant to be a CEO. He always would tell me, you're great in the bullets. You love to do the work. He's like, I need you to
Mm,
get up here. And that's always been something that was hard, but that has helped me a ton. I love to read. And so then as soon as I read, I'm like, what else? Like if I find somebody's thinking that I love, I'm like, what else? How can I pay to be in proximity to this person? So, I mean, like Michael Hyatt, for example, is a well-known name in the business space. I paid for a year to be able to go once a quarter and spend 2 full days, working in group settings. And that put me next to Chick-fil-A franchisees. That put me next to people with multi-million dollar businesses. We were just roundtables talking about different challenges. And I feel like all of a sudden the mindset, because I was capped at a certain point, it's like I only
Hmm.
knew what I could do by sheer grit and like what I'd seen my parents do and friends do. So every time we reach a new level, I'm like, who is 10 steps ahead of me and how can I be next to them? And that's why I think that even today for property managers, multifamily people that want to go further in their career, it's like, how can you get yourself, how can you condense, decades into days by being around someone that's been there and done it? And I think that's been the biggest lesson for me.
I think that's a great piece of advice. And it's sort of, I don't want to ask the same question twice, but it made me think about just being such a successful businesswoman in a traditionally male dominated industry. What advice would you give other young women coming up in the ranks, whether they're, still in college or maybe they are in their first property management gig, but they know that there's something more there and they feel this special spark and they want to do something on their own one day, beyond just, kind of looking to that person who's 10 steps ahead? Do you have any other specific pieces of advice? And I know this is another curveball,
Yeah.
that
No, I
that
love
comes to
it.
mind, for those young women.
I think one of the things is, there's a lot of conversations around affirmations, and I believe in use whatever works for you. But what I love over affirmation is evidence. And when you have evidence in your corner, what happens is a little bit of confidence builds. So for example, I still get very nervous in certain scenarios, especially when it's a lot of men. But I'm not as nervous when I know that I have evidence of having done something or know that I know what I'm talking about. And so I always say, evidence over affirmations. So when you get the skills, you start building that reputation, and that's why I was willing to do things for free, because sometimes I was very nervous, like, oh, what if they pay me and I don't know how to do it and then it's not good. But the first time that then I was like, this was successful, I sold out a session, I'm going to charge next time. And then it was like, great feedback, I'm going to charge again. Same thing. Like, I can transform your multi-million dollar asset. I can see things that maybe you don't see at the moment. Okay, well, I did it once. Was that luck? Oh no, I did it again. Okay, I've got a method. So I think for them, it's pick up any skills that you can. And then I also think be willing to, have a seat at the table. And something that is maybe a little bit untraditional is like, I do embrace the feminine part of me. Like, I don't try to walk in with male energy. Like, that's just not me. It's like, I have feelings, I have emotions. I like, that is who I am. And at the beginning, I started like very tailored and very like this way.
Yeah.
And over the years, I've seen myself be a softer version of like who I am. It's like, I like to encourage people, but I also will give you a dose of reality. And I also mess up a lot. I can be impulsive. And so I think to that is like that little secret sauce that you have, just figure out how to make that work for you. And some of it is going to be, trial and error. And I will say there's scenarios, Chris, that I was in that I would address them very differently now. I've told this story before, but I was in a boardroom meeting once presenting a branding project, and the CEO was like talking to the group, and all of a sudden he comes and he starts like rubbing my shoulders as he's talking to the group. And I'm thinking to myself, he would have never done that to a man, right? And thankfully, it was all of 2 seconds before his, partner on the other side was like, "What are you doing, dude?" He's like, and I don't even, there was just a layer of feeling like that was acceptable. Now that was 15, 14 years ago. I was a lot younger and I was honestly caught off guard. That would never happen. I would have spoken up for myself a little bit quicker. I think I
Mm,
still would have, but those are the kind of things that I don't think they happen all the time. And I think the world is changing where that would probably be even less acceptable now. But I think it's just to be willing to say, like, what am I okay with? What am I not okay with? And have a voice.
yeah. Well, we're gonna definitely have some notes in the show notes here for any young women who want to follow along with your story, and definitely tap into some of your LinkedIn updates, which are great, by the way, for entrepreneurial mindsets and so forth. But as we begin to wrap up, I really want to learn a little bit more about the bigger picture of Sprout, because from what you've shared so far, it's more than just being like another vendor, another partner out there. I know relationships mean a lot to you. I know being strategic as a businesswoman means so much to you. It's always been more than just being a business. And I'm curious how that will manifest in the next, let's say, 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
So, last year I made a partnership with a psychologist to bring him in to help our members deal with some of the challenges that they're dealing with, conversations. How do you deal with them in a way that's, correct? And I've just continued to bring in different people. Last year I got certified as a wellness coach. So I am looking at things a lot more holistically. Like you said, it's about creating a community to me that is off of LinkedIn, off of social media. It's a community that I can help really just be a part of and have a bigger conversation. And, the podcast that I host, Marketing Home, Marketing You, a big focus is on the you part. I really see us as a company diving deeper in the whole approach of the person. I think the multifamily professional is facing a lot of challenges right now. And I'd like to be that strategic partnership of a cheerleader with all the tools that go with it. So I think just really digging into the personal people component of it and developing tools that are also practical, as we get into more things with AI and things like that. But how do we keep including the human element? I feel like that's the space I want to stay in.
I love that. One of my favorite parts of podcasting is hitting you with a few rapid fire questions as we start to wrap up.
Okay.
So I think that we were sort of like spitballing some ideas around where we could head with the rapid fire round. So when it comes to Sprout as a business, Sprout as a growing business, and now more wellness focused, more educationally focused, from a female-led business perspective, what is the biggest challenge that you see yourself facing in the next 5 years?
So the biggest challenge is just clarity on what direction. There's so many opportunities, and there's the constant balance for me personally of like the life. My 9 to 5 has to support my 5 to 9, and it does for my team and for my clients. So it's constantly saying no to opportunities that I want to do. I want to do everything. So yeah, that's the biggest challenge is like, I want to be able to create a really great home environment and a great family at the same time as building a business. And so that's been the challenge from day one. I'm still like that 20-year-old that, I think I'm doing a decent job, but it's like, it's a reframing every single day, every single week to make sure my priorities are lined up.
Makes sense. All right. The one book that you would recommend right now, I know this is always really difficult for guests, but what comes to mind and why?
So from a sales perspective, I'm reading right now $100 Million Offers by Alex Hormozy. And I love how he frames like making offers that are so incredible that people just can't refuse. I love that from a marketing sales perspective. I love the 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman if you're just looking at, life and how you want to use it.
Awesome. Man, this has been so much fun. There's always just one more thing to do on these podcasts, and that is to roll out the red carpet for you, Barbara. Tell the world what you're up to and where they can find you online if they want to follow up.
Okay. I feel like LinkedIn has become my journal, my business journal. So if somebody wants to hear deep thoughts and just kind of business advice, I'm on LinkedIn. Every once in a while, I'll get that silly side that most people don't always see. And I love Instagram for that. I connect a lot in the DMs there. So I'm at Sprout Marketing there. And then if they want to join my newsletter, I send an email to that every single week at barbarasavona.com, or follow the podcast at Marketing Home, Marketing You.
Awesome. And we'll link everything in the show notes so all the listeners and viewers can follow along and be in touch. Barbara, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Chris. I always love when we get to chat. It's so much fun.